Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Lessons, which is episode 19 of season 6 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the 6th season episode Lessons. So Lessons is the episode where Picard falls in love with the lieutenant commander under his command, and they find it difficult to navigate having a relationship with one of his subordinates and how he would deal with that situation. It makes for some awkward moments until Picard comes comfortable with it. However, he is forced to send her on a dangerous mission in which she is trapped there, and he has to order her to hold her ground and stay there, which could mean her life. And Picard becomes devastated and so fearful that she died, and it was under his orders that he shuts down emotionally. And but it turns out she survived, and when he finds she's alive, he's of course very much relieved. But they both realize that they cannot continue being in the same command structure because she resented him for having gave the orders, and he of course blamed himself for having give the orders. So she realizes that the only proper thing to do is to transfer to another ship, but they say that they will maintain their relationship, which of course they don't, because this isn't just a romance of the week. Anyway, so sometimes when I do these little summaries, I kind of give away or hint at my feelings of the episode, and so I should just jump right straight into it since I kind of hinted at it. This episode to me is a failure mainly for one reason and one reason alone, and that's because that we never see or hear of this character ever again. So who gives a fuck about anything that happens in this episode? Now here's the thing. I know that TNG is episodic to an extent. I don't think it's as episodic as people claim, but that's another discussion which I've had so many times before, so I won't rehash it here. But I realize that TNG is episodic, and every once in a while they'll have an episode where something happens and it's completely forgotten about and never talked about again, and that doesn't necessarily mean I think it's a bad episode, because some of my favorite episodes are like that, such as The Offspring, which should be consequential because Data creates a daughter, and yet they never mention it again. Even when in the show Picard, when he has a daughter, no one mentions, oh, he had his other daughter from before. Or episodes like Clues, where the kind of the whole point is that everyone forgets about what happens except Data, who's not allowed to ever talk about it, so they never talk about it ever again. And there's many, many more episodes that it was just a one-off, and they're never mentioned or even, considered ever existing ever again. But my thing is that there's some premises that only work if you do mention them again. They only work like the way the whole premise is structured. Like if you wipe it clean and pretend like it never happened, then it kind of undermines the entire episode. The biggest example for this for me is, and I keep talking about this episode, but it's over in Deep Space Nine. I haven't gotten to this point in Deep Space Nine yet, but I have already reviewed this episode. It's a little episode called Hard Time, which the whole point of the episode is that you can't get over PTSD and traumatic experiences like that. It's a long process that takes years and years to get over, and then the episode ends and he's instantly over it the next episode, so it undermines the entire premise. To me, that is the worst example, and I balk at people who try to make excuses for that and be like, oh, it's just episodic. No, bullshit. Undermines, like some premises undermine. And here's how that comes into effect with this episode. and I notice this particularly watching this episode now, because as I'm going through it for these reviews, I sort of give it more of a chance and sort of pay more attention to it than I ever had before. And to be honest, this episode never really grabbed me before. And I gotta be honest, it has a lot to do with the fact when I first saw this, I was 13 years old, and I thought it was the boringest thing ever. And mind you, at this point in time, I actually still thought that The Inner Light was boring, which is an opinion I absolutely do not have anymore. I am amazed that I used to have that opinion. But when I first saw this episode, yeah, I thought this was the boringest thing ever. I'm like, who gives a fuck? And, you know, some episodes like The Inner Light, obviously, as I grew older, I learned to appreciate it more and more mature, and I was like, actually, I do appreciate it. It's an amazing episode. This one, I never did. I didn't think it was that boring as I got older, but I never learned to, like, really appreciate this episode. And so as I was watching it yesterday, you know, as I do for these reviews, I tried to really analyze it, really think about it, and give it a chance, and not try to prejudge it. And I realized the reason why I never changed my mind that much on this episode as opposed to other episodes like The Inner Light. And I realize that has a lot to do with the fact that we never see Commander Darrin again, and this is just another Romance of the Week episode. Now, that is a cliche that, again, there's some examples where this works. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are some that I like that's just a romance for one episode and we never ever see ever again. But that is a cliche. It is like, it's hard to really develop a deep romance within one episode. Like, it works. That is something that works better if you build it, if you do reoccurrences. Like, even Vosh, even her, they brought back, at least for one other episode with Picard. It was another episode without Picard on Deep Space Nine, but that doesn't really count because he wasn't there. Yeah, but in general, like, specifically, I keep thinking about Cassidy Yates. And I honestly, watching this episode, I think that this relationship of Picard and Commander Darrin would have worked better than Cassidy Yates and Sisko. I mean, honestly, I think that relationship actually didn't really work at first. The two didn't really have much chemistry, but then later on, as they kept going and going and going, they built some chemistry between them. So by the time you get to the end of the series, they did have chemistry. But at first, it was only because if they did it as a one-off, like, Romance of the Week, then it would have sucked. And I don't think that's necessarily the case here, because I don't think it sucks as a romance. I just think that it undermines the whole purpose of this episode, because it's kind of the opposite, because the episode does such a good job of building the connection between Picard and Darrin. It kind of makes it clear that it's not a romance of the week, because a lot of romances of the week is infatuation, is two people fall in love, in lust more than love. I'm thinking of that stupid Dax episode with Meridian and DS9. That's one of the worst examples of the romance of the week, because it shows that Jadzia is willing to give up 60 years of her life and all of her friends for some dude she just met a week ago and is only in lust with and not in love. And there's even Vosh, you could argue, was kind of more of a lust thing than a love thing. And most of the romances of the week are like that. Not, to be clear, not that there's anything wrong with having a lustful relationship or portraying it in our main characters in Star Trek. Like, it can be interesting storytelling, and it's not at all demeaning. Like, everyone has has needs, as they say, and so there's nothing wrong with exploring that aspect. But that's not what's being done here. Here they are portraying love. They're portraying a deep relationship. In fact, they do a really good job at it, particularly with the connection with the music and the fact that Picard is willing to share like this deep and personal thing. And this is, I think, part of the reason why I learned to appreciate this episode more on this watch around is because of how much I love the Inner Light now. And I think that's another reason why I thought this episode was boring as hell when I first saw it, because I didn't give a shit about the Inner Light. But now that it is one of my favorite episodes of the franchise, and I try to look at this episode in a new light, I'm starting to realize just how deep the relationship between Picard and Commander Darrin is, and that he was willing, like, he had this whole lifetime of experience where he had a wife and children, and so this music was intimate to him. It reminded him of having that deep, long-lasting love, not just romantic love, but the love for his family and the love for his children. And that's something that he hasn't really experienced in, real life, so to say, as Jean-Luc Picard. Not really, not like that. And so, by sharing that music with her and having that deep connection, is the reason why he was willing to do that was because he could feel that connection with her brewing. And once he shared that story, and once they connected, then they started to have that kind of deep connection that he had with Helene back in the Inner Light. And so I was actually tearing up a little bit, to be honest, when I was watching that scene when Picard was telling Commander Darrin about the music, because I was trying to absorb into the episode and really analyze it, and I got really invested in what this episode was actually trying to say. And this is something I don't think I've ever noticed, because I kind of only watched this episode at a surface level, and the surface level does come off as kind of dull and boring. But I start to realize that how deep his connection with Commander Darrin is, and how this was such a sort of revelation for him, and that's why he was so deeply affected by when he thought that she had died, and how he emotionally shut down. Now, this reminded me of my personal life. When I was 19, I believe, I met who would become my wife, and then who would become my ex-wife. She was from New Zealand, and she came over to America for a 6-month visa, but she had to leave after 6 months. And I had arranged to go to New Zealand, but for whatever reason, I didn't actually arrange to go over there until a month after she left. So there was going to be a month where the two of us were apart after being together for 6 months. And I remember, and I didn't think much of the time. I was like, yeah, a month apart, that's no big deal. But I remember driving her to the airport and dropping her off, then coming home and realizing that she wasn't there anymore. Like, my throat started hurting. Like, I could physically feel the emptiness and the lacking of it. And it was a different feeling when she left me, because she left voluntarily, so that was a totally different emotion. Not saying I did feel deep emotions then, but it was totally different. And I think the way I felt here is more analogous to what Picard goes through in this episode, because she didn't leave him voluntarily. He thought that she died. Now, of course, that's much worse than having someone leave for a month when you know you're going to see them in a month, thinking that someone's dead. So obviously what Picard would go through would be much, much worse, and plus he would feel guilt over ordering her, so it's totally different. But it still reminded me of that. It still reminded me of how I had a physical feeling of emptiness, and that my throat started hurting. There was nothing wrong with my throat. I didn't have a sore throat or anything. It's just the moment I got into my car to leave the airport after dropping her off, it was like, it was just instant pain. And so that's what I'm reminded of Picard feeling that the instant pain of not even being able to move or anything. And as I said, what he's going through would be much worse because he thinks that she might be dead. But yeah, I could relate to that, and I totally bought them earning this situation. It wasn't like the Dax thing where when she says, oh, she feels sad that she left her boyfriend, you don't buy it because it wasn't earned. It was just they had some lustful relationship for like a week, and oh no, now she's sad. Bullshit, she is. Where here, they like with the intimate conversations with Picard and him sharing like this deep personal part of himself, and just the way they play, like it was a really well written episode, which was written by Renee Echevarria, which gets back to how he's one of my favorite writers of Star Trek. Not that every episode he writes is great, but this one is. Well, not great, but it's well written, is what I mean to say. So it does such a good job of really saying what a deep connection they have. So it's a love. It's not a lust. It's not an infatuation situation. It is a deeper, more meaningful relationship that is actually love. That could be like a family relationship. Like he could see himself having children and raising a family with her. And they were sort of making that like really clear. But he just couldn't adjust to how he should react of having to separate his professional relationship with her with his personal relationship with her, which I think was actually a pretty good story. So my whole point is that because of that, because they portrayed this as such a deep, meaningful relationship, when she disappears from the show, it undercuts the whole point of this episode, because that's an uppercut. I said undercut. Uppercut. Anyway, it undercuts the whole point of this episode, because they took all this time to really convey a deep, meaningful relationship, and then poof, who gives a fuck? It's gone. He never talks about it ever again. I mean, it would have made more sense if she, like, actually did die, but then he would be depressed, and if they never, like, followed up on him being depressed several episodes after, then that would be just as bad, if not worse. Or if she left him, she said, well, we can't do this anymore. I don't want to see you again. Now, some people might argue that they did essentially break up in this episode. They were just fooling themselves to say, oh, yeah, no, sure, we'll still visit each other. Some people do that, right? And you could argue that's what happened. But to me, that wasn't a satisfactory separation of this deep relationship. That they wouldn't just be like, oh, yeah, we can't be on the same ship, so therefore we're going to drift apart and it's going to be over. Now, if they actually showed them drifting apart later, okay. But to me, it seems like this was the woman that Picard wanted to have children with. Not a fling like Vosh, not someone that he liked having sex with, or who was fun to be around, but someone he wanted to call his wife, someone that he could see himself building a family with. In fact, I could see Picard in the future being like referring to her as the one who got away. And because of that, I don't buy that Picard would just let her go that easily. Would be like, oh yeah, sure, no, we'll definitely keep in touch. which is essentially what this episode's trying to tell us, and I think that's bullshit. So I think one of two things should have happened. Either they, and this would probably be my preferable thing that they have done, if they just found a way to deal with it, to be like, this sucks being under your command, but we need to deal with this. We need to. I mean, this is a horrible experience. Of you thought that you sent me to my death, and I was kind of resentful for you because I thought you sent me to my death. But we need to learn with this. Let's do some counseling sessions with Counselor Troy. We need to come to terms with this and deal with this going forward, because our relationship is important enough to both of us that we will work through this shit. So she becomes a main recurring character and stays on the Enterprise, and we see him just like Cassidy Yates kind of. Or option number 2, which I still think would have been acceptable and preferable to what they did do, but I still prefer option number 1. But option number 2 is that, okay, she does take the transfer, she goes to a starbase, whatever, but they make more of an effort to stay in touch. And perhaps they could even say, let's get married, because there have been characters who have been married and been assigned to different stations. Like LaForge talked about his parents, how they were married, but they were often assigned to different stations, but they still managed to keep in touch, and so they could be like, look, this relationship is important enough, like it's not going to work with you being under my command, but this relationship is too important to just give up for that. And so they find a way to balance their careers and balance their relationship. And then she actually would become kind of similar to Cassidy as well, because Cassidy is a character who would often leave the station to do her own career and do her own work, and she'd be gone for a while, then she'd come back, then she'd be gone for a while, then come back. I think towards the end, when she got married to Benjamin, she more moved into the station, because that was a big step, a very big step. But anyway, for the most part, she would often leave and then come back. And so they could have, and now this would be more distant, obviously, if she was assigned to a starbase and he was on the Enterprise going or shooting around the galaxy. He would have to make more of an effort to get back to her starbase and might not be able to do it as often, but it still could work. And they still could have her be a reoccurring character, one who maybe doesn't even pop up all that much. Like if she was on the Enterprise, you would have to have her reoccur a lot. But if she was on the starbase, you could have her show up every twice a season or something like that. Oh, there's Commander Darrin. I mean, let's be honest here. The reason why, and I think that one of the writers might even said this, but I can't remember, but the real reason why they didn't do that is because they wanted to be able to continue to have the romance of the week with Picard. And if he was in a long-term relationship like that, that would preclude him from doing that, which, again, they gave Benjamin a long-term relationship. So I don't know why the fuck they wouldn't be able to do that with Picard. Now, I'm trying to think if he had any other romance of the week episodes. They did play up a romance with him and Dr. Crusher in season 7, and of course they wouldn't have been able to do that with Darrin, or that would have been seen as kind of an infidelity in a sense if they did. And maybe, they could have played into the love triangle aspect of it, but I don't know. That just, as much as I love the Picard and Crusher thing, I think that they could have dropped it for this. But yeah, I'm looking at all the episodes of season 6 and 7. I don't see any other Romance of the Week episodes for Picard. So there's no reason not to continue a romantic relationship with her. So yeah, I think this completely ruins the episode that she just disappears and never heard of or mentioned ever again. Yeah, it undermines the whole point of them having a deep, meaningful relationship, which is what this episode is building for. If they're like at the end, they're like, "Oh well, we'll keep in touch." Like that undermines the entire point of the episode. And again, I can see some people arguing, well, that happens and sometimes when people try to keep long-distance relationship and it just doesn't work. Like, they did this in Discovery with Gray and Adira, and I didn't like that either, but some people were okay with that. But at least with Gray and Adira, I did kind of buy that because they followed up on it. They just didn't have Gray like, oh yeah, sure, we'll keep in touch, whatever. They actually did follow up and did have them keep in touch and realized that they were drifting apart and that they were still happy with each other and they still kept in touch. Like, if they would have done that, I would have been more okay with it. But I still personally would have liked it way better. As I said, I think the best option would be to keep Commander, have them figure out their shit, work on their ship, keep Commander Darrin on the Enterprise, and have her be a reoccurring character. And I think that would have been the best option. And they could have made her have a family with Picard. And even suggest that they do that in the future. But no, it's the fucking writers want, oh, we need to make him free so he can be a ladies' man. Which is stupid. It renders this whole episode pointless. It's like this episode's now a complete and utter waste of time because it portrays such a deep relationship that just ends like that, and they're like, oh yeah, sure, we'll keep in touch. It makes you think that it's not as deep as that they were telling you this was in this episode. And the whole thing about, the whole theme of Picard having to deal with, how do I deal with a subordinate who I'm in love with, which again was the pitch for this episode. But I think, like, if they played it as kind of a fickle, like, infatuation type deal, like they did with, what's-her-face, the Sora who had the fling with Data, and in theory, like, if they did that sort of thing, then I could see that working as a one-off, but that's not what they did. They betrayed a very deep relationship, and to have it be a one-off is an insult to this episode, and it undermines the whole thing, and it renders the whole thing pointless. So you go back and watch it, and like, what a waste of time. At least I do. So, I gotta talk about, of course, since I brought up the Inner Light, gotta talk about the Inner Light. This is something I mentioned when I talked about the Inner Light in the past, that the whole point of that episode was that Picard would become a teacher and teach everyone about Catan, the settlers of Catan. Sorry. And the inhabitants of Catan. He didn't. He's like, I'm going to tell you a secret, something I've never told anyone. And like, Picard, you dick, why aren't you telling people? Like, that's the one thing they ask you to do. Like, that was the whole purpose of sending you the probe. That's the thing that your wife fucking said to you when you went off. She was like, tell them about us. Now, there is some way to headcanon your way around this. Because it is possible that Picard did tell them about the people of Catan without necessarily getting personal about his family and his wife and his children and his grandchildren. He could have just in general said this is what their culture was like and they're good people and these are the kind of artifacts they have, and share some of his intimate knowledge that he gained from a lifetime of living there. And it's always been my headcanon that he wrote a book. It kind of, if you're doing it in the same vein as like Game of Thrones, or Lord of the Rings, because at the end of Game of Thrones, Sam wrote a book called it The Song of Ice and Fire, which is the name of the book series that the show was based off of. Or on Lord of the Rings, of course, Frodo wrote his chapter of Bilbo's book was called The Lord of the Rings. And so in that same vein, Picard could write a book called The Inner Light. That was all about the settlers of Catan. Like, I think that's my headcanon. My headcanon is that he did write a book about it, and or paper or something, but probably a book, and maybe a hollow novel like the Doctor. No, a book. He wrote a book about it, but he didn't really talk that much about. It was more of a dry sort of a history book type cultural examination, that he didn't go into personal details about his family. So when he says to Commander Darrin that I never shared this with anyone, he's speaking more specifically about, because when he was talking to her, he wasn't talking about the world of Catan and his culture. He was talking about his wife and his children and his grandchildren. So maybe that's the aspect that he never shared with. And plus, playing the music, playing the song is also way too personal for him. So he might tell people about the culture, but not really play that Inner Light song or whatever. And him opening up to her and being able to play it was very personal. So I will take that as my headcanon to excuse this. But otherwise, he fucking sucked and didn't do the one thing that they fucking, there's a whole reason why they made him live a whole entire life. It's the whole reason, and for him not to do it would seem very shitty. But anyway, also speaking of Dr. Crusher, I did like the scene where Commander Darrin went to sickbay before she officially got together with Jean-Luc, and Jean-Luc was talking about her to Beverly at the breakfast, and then we get the scene with Commander Darrin sickbay, and she's talking about Jean-Luc, and whoa, did you know this? And it's kind of obvious to her that she's, especially after hearing Jean-Luc talk about her, it's obvious that they're kind of building a thing. And I love the way this is shot. I was just noticing this because it starts to pan closer and closer on Beverly as they're talking. Like, it starts with the two shot, and it doesn't cut. It just slowly zooms in and pans in on Beverly until it's like on a close-up of Beverly as Commander Darrin is talking. But you don't see her, you just see this close-up of Beverly and her reaction. I think that was actually brilliant because it's emphasizing that she's a little jelly, that she's a little jealous. And it does this in such a good way. There was previous episodes I complained about, like we'll always have Paris, where Picard's hooking up with his old flame, and they had this really awkward, weird scene with Troy going up to Beverly and being like, oh, are you okay, and blah blah, and Beverly was like, I can't compete. How can I compete with a ghost? I'm like, where the fuck is this coming from? How are you competing? Like, you're not even with Jean-Luc. Like, that makes no sense. And I think there was another episode, I can't remember, where Beverly was being like overtly jealous, and it didn't make any sense. But here, where it's done in a subtle way, like you can miss it if you're not really paying attention, where it's kind of under the surface, because the thing with Beverly is that she does have feelings for Jean-Luc, but they're buried deep because she had already come to the conclusion that it's, for many reasons, part of being under his command, but other reasons is that it wouldn't work between them, and so she suppresses those feelings. But when she sees these two, who are obviously falling in love, she can't help but feel a little jealous of that. And I think it was portrayed so well. It is so subtle, and it is done so well. And also, I like the way that they use Troy. I love that Jean-Luc actually went to see Counselor Troy, which is exactly what he should do, and it's exactly what she's there for. And it's very rare we actually see Troy doing her job and doing what she's supposed to do. In fact, I kind of wish we got more scenes with her and Troy, because he basically, all Troy said with Picard's like, Troy said, it sounds like you're asking me for permission. And Jean-Luc's like, well, if I was, would you give it? And she says, yes. And then Jean-Luc sort of goes to Commander Darrin. This was after he was like, it's very good, Commander, in the turbolift. And she was like, obviously pissed off about that. And he goes to her and says, I'm sorry. He does the right thing. He apologizes, and he's honest. He's like, I just didn't know how to react when I wasn't, it was weird for me to be seen with the crew. And he just froze up and didn't know how to react, which is beautiful. But I just wish that we got more of that scene with Troy talking to Picard, that he would have been able to sort of, because all she said is, I give you permission. But I think it would have been nicer if we got more of Troy saying, this is how you should handle being around, a subordinate who you having a romance with, and these are my suggestions, and when you're with the crew, do this, and maybe talk him through it, because it seemed like he instantly changed his mind too quickly, and instantly knew the right thing to do to apologize, which I think it would have been better if Troy gave him more sort of counseling fucking job, and gave him more coaching and counseling on how to handle the situation. So it was a good scene. I think it would have been better though if they had a little bit more. So the other important thing about this episode is the music. I did call this, when I did my top 10 favorite episode soundtracks of TNG, this was in the honorable mentions. I don't know. I think I might have it higher in the honorable mentions if I were to do it again, because it's not just the scenes of the music that Picard and Darrin played together, which were great, and I think that's all I was thinking of, because it was so great to get a sort of remix of the Inner Light song, which is interesting because that was originally done by Jay Chataway. But this soundtrack for this episode was done by Dennis McCarthy. So I wonder if it was someone different who did the Inner Light song. I'm pretty sure Jay Chataway did do the Inner Light song, or wrote that. So I wonder if they got him back to do the remix, or if Dennis McCarthy just added his own twist on Jay Chataway's music. Or if it was like the actual musician who played it, who did it for both episodes, and they're the ones that did the adjustment. I don't know how that works, but it's not just because hearing that Inner Light duet that he did with Commander Darrin in the Jeffrey Tube thingy, that was beautiful. That's, again, this is what's part of what sold this relationship is so deep and so strong. That was a very beautiful remix of it, and bringing back, especially, mostly because of the Inner Light and how powerful that episode is, and that brings back all the emotions, and it does for Jean-Luc in that scene. So there's a lot of subtext to them playing that duet together that goes beyond what you see on the surface, which is part of what makes it so brilliant. But it's not just that music, which is great in this episode. There's actually the music, the score that you hear towards the end of the episode when Picard thinks that Commander Darrin has died, and that is, he ordered her to die. And when you see him in his quarters, like looking at his flute, they play this music. Like the whole scene is really sold by the music because Patrick Stewart's performance, of course, is always amazing and always sells it as well, but the music really sells that whole scene. It really portrays just how depressed and how deeply affected that he was by by her, thinking that she's died, and the music really sells it. So that is why I'd probably put it in my top 10, not just an honorable mention, if I did it again, because I think the music is definitely a huge highlight of this episode. But, you know what, and I gotta be honest, I'm gonna have to put this episode in the category of the B-plot bullshit. Now, tenuously, it barely makes that classification, but I thought about this a lot. But I think, to be fair, I do have to classify it as that because nobody gives a shit about the firestorms. I'm sorry, nobody does. Now, to be fair, they did tie it into the main plot by having that be the method that put Commander Darrin's life in danger, and that's why, and so that's why I almost don't want to call it that, because usually when I talk about this useless B-plot, it's something totally useless. It doesn't have anything to do anything. It's just there to create a threat. And this does tie into the main emotional story of Picard, but I still classify it as that because it is still just there to make a threat. It's like, there's not much of a threat in this episode, so let's create this firestorm. And I gotta mention that when I'm watching the Blu-rays, they have the promo at the start of the episode, the original trailer, the commercial for the episode that came out when it first aired, and the trailer for this one, I was watching it, and it was saying that Picard's love interest is put in danger by a raging firestorm, and I was like, that's probably not the only raging firestorm. There's probably another one in Jean-Luc's pants. If you know what I'm saying. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm a child, but that's what I thought. That's what I thought of when I saw that promo. But point is, I got off track there. But the point is so this would be number 2 for season 6 for the useless B plot, and both of the ones, the other one in season 6 was True Q, and that barely qualified as well. So there's only been 2 so far in season 6, and both of them barely qualified, whereas in season 5 they had 7 that really qualified for it. And I keep talking about how season 5 is definitely the worst. I don't know if there'll be any more in season 6. I doubt it. I don't think I'd call the one Second Chances one. But there may be one that I'm not remembering. Season 4 had 4, so they were pretty bad as well. But season 5, 7. But at least to be fair, I think this is the second one in season 6 so far. Anyway, I would gotta talk about how I thought this episode was boring originally, and I think that is because it is kind of dull. It doesn't really have a plot other than Picard feeling funny about having a subordinate, being in love with a subordinate. And I think that they sort of milk that plot for more than what it's worth, to be honest. Like the whole thing with Riker being uncomfortable with her giving orders like that. it seems like they were trying too hard to make more of that idea, and it seems like there's just not enough of that idea to sustain an episode. And so that's why they came up with the raging firestorm. Sorry, that's just an interesting verb for me. But anyway, that's why they came up with the raging firestorm, to try to create more excitement, because that is the problem with this episode, is there's not enough there as far as the plot goes. To me, that would have been fine. That actually would make no difference, because you don't always need a plot if you're doing a really good character story. But the fact that she never appears ever again undermines it, because it's a character story that means nothing. It's never brought up ever again. It means nothing for Picard's character. It won't affect anything. So what's the fucking point of it? And again, I don't want to hear this, well, it's true about a lot of episodic episodes. No, it's not. Because other ones will have subtext and will mean something even if it's never brought up again. But something like this demands to be brought up again, and if it's not, then no point in it. Simple. Anyway, I would now like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It does help me continue with the channel, and I'm very thankful. So I'd like to give a big special thanks to Antarius and to Brandon Neilhouse. Thank you so much for your support. Very much appreciated. And would also like to give a shout out to Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Miglesio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very much for your support. Very much appreciated. So we have a few Patreon comments for this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, "Lessons more like mess, son." I like this one. It was nice to hear the Inner Light song again. It would have been better if Picard and that lady did a song with Vic Fontaine. See, I thought you were going to say it would have been better if Picard and that lady stayed together, but no, you always gotta bring in Vic Fontaine into it. My God, that is the one thing that could have made this episode about 1,000,000,000 times worse. Fuck Vic Fontaine. Anyway, next comment is from Norman Buckwald, who says, "I do admit the first time I saw this episode, it came across as a yawn fest, but future viewings made me appreciate Picard falling in love and do a good job of what happens when you need to assign personnel on dangerous missions. Still, I have to admit, leaving it behind as only a romance of the week was disappointing. In fact, to this day, outside maybe Captain Freeman having to assign her daughter on dangerous missions, is the closest we have to this type of scenario. Remember, neither Book or Cassidy were members of Starfleet, so they do not count and are outside of Tom Paris expressing concern for B'Elanna. Tom was not even in temporary role of captaining a ship. Maybe if we got insight on the Titan with Riker and Troy, but even there, we only see Troy putting her hand over her eyes in embarrassment when Riker does his and a 1 and a 2 to warp. Anyway, I will give this episode 7.5 out of 10. Always seems to be a solid enough episode for me, and probably the closest in Trek lore do we see Picard truly in a relationship. I mean, Laris, not really, and what happened with Crusher was almost all off screen outside of maybe a kiss and All Good Things and their later divorce. And Norman Buckwald follows up to that comment saying, "Given that the closest to this dilemma was Sisko and Cassidy, had to let him know no, you can't keep me out of danger if I want to do my job. So that may be the closest scenario we have to this episode. Again, Cassidy is not part of Starfleet and does not work under him, so it's not the same thing. You know, that's true about Sisko and Cassidy, because he did try to use his professional authority to curtail her career, and she was not happy with this, and they got into a big fight over it, and blah blah blah. It led to him backing off. But that is different than the situation that is portrayed in this episode. But I would argue that even though Book is not technically in Starfleet, there were many scenarios in which he was under her command. And they made that clear that she could give him orders. And particularly in season 5, there was a lot of situations where they both went into dangerous situations. Or I think there were even some scenarios where she sent him on some dangerous missions that she did not go on. And so she was putting his life in danger. And the two of them actually dealt with this fine. Like, they were able to deal with this scenario perfectly fine, a lot better than Picard and Darrin sorted out in this episode. So I think that might have been an example where they just proved how they made that kind of relationship work. Even though, I know technically Book wasn't in Starfleet, but he was still under her command, so I think it still counts. Whereas Cassidy was never under Sisko's command. He just commanded the station and tried to throw his weight around to get the Bajoran Commerce Authority to do what he wanted, and that was sort of uncalled for, and I agree is different than what's portrayed in this episode. But I think the Book and Burnham thing actually is pretty much what this episode was portraying, and they actually showed an example of how they dealt with it just fine. Anyway, but that is just me. Next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, the biggest surprise in this episode isn't that Picard falls in love with Nella Darrin, it's he actually smiles. You don't see Picard doing that a lot. Vosh wasn't suited for Picard. She would have been better if she met Riker instead on Risa. Picard opened his heart to Nella Darrin and is just look at his emotions when he thought she was dead. He was a broken man when he went to the transporter room, and when she didn't beam up, you could feel his emotions. I wished Nella Darrin remained on the Enterprise, as it would have been good to explore the relationship. If Wendy Hughes didn't pass away in 2014, she could have been in Picard. So my rating is 8. Terry Matalas should have brought back Nella Darrin, a different actress of course, but instead he made so many dumb decisions, and the Borg is number 1 on the list, and all the Modern Track haters can have season 3 of Picard because I don't want it out of 10. So yeah, totally agree with you. They should have kept Nella Darrin in the show, and I think by Picard it was kind of too late because she was a one-off character and would have been just a crazy Easter egg that most people would have been like, who? Especially if you recast her, which sadly, as you mentioned, they would have had to, because sadly the actress did pass away in 2014. So in those scenarios, I think it was better to just go to Crusher, because that's something the fans would be more familiar with, and the whole Nella thing would have seemed like a weird Easter egg that only the nerds like me and you would get. So I can kind of see why they didn't do that in Picard, but I do agree with you that, yeah, all the Modern Trek haters can have Picard Season 3. I don't want it either. Anyway, I mean, it's more of a mixed bag, to be fair. There's some good things about it, but I think it's mostly negative. But really, yeah, the Nella Darrin, they should have kept her in this show, after this episode. That is the flat-out thing. Once they just made her one-off, then they kind of ruined the whole thing. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, if this storyline If the storyline would have been much better if it was stretched over a couple of episodes. This way it feels like the romance from, in theory, all of a sudden a crew member becomes highly important and then disappears forever after 45 minutes. It's so good they followed up on the episode The Inner Light, but obviously Picard misunderstood the probe. Instead of telling everybody about the lost culture, he's almost keeping the experience as a private secret. The firestorm was not a good plot idea, and it certainly wasn't a good idea to establish a colony on a planet with such dangerous phenomenon. The best aspect of this episode was, in my opinion, its music. My rating is a 6 out of 10. Totally agree about the music, and I totally agree that if they weren't willing to make her a long-term permanent reoccurring character and have Picard and her marry, which I think they should have, the very least they could have done is had her be in like 3 or 4 episodes. Make this a longer arc and then come up with a better reason for them splitting up. That's my thing. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, I actually really like this episode. Again, it shows that Picard is a 3-dimensional human being that does indeed have feelings, and I actually like the romance between Picard and Nella. I really bought the chemistry, their romance, and their interactions, but the best part of this episode is the Picard and Nella playing the Inner Light theme with his flute and her piano. I always cry when they play this song, and especially when Picard opens himself up to her and tells her his experience of the events in the Inner Light. Also, at the end, when she was put in dangerous situation, I could feel Picard's fear for Nella's life. I wish she appeared again instead of a one-off. But let's be honest, this is one of the better one-off romance in the show. The Inner Light music makes it stand out, so my rating is an 8 out of 10. I'm not so sure I agree that this is one of the better one-off romances in the show, just because that it doesn't work as a one-off romance. Like, it's so good that it deserves to be more than a one-off, and the fact they make it a one-off kind of undermines the whole thing, in my opinion. And so sometimes one-off romances like Vosh actually work better, because I know Stephen King hates Vosh and Picard together, but I think it does the opposite of Trax thing, and plus their relationship was superficial, that you buy it as a one-off or two-off, as the case may be, romance, and not a recurring thing where this should have been a marriage. I'm sorry, but Renee Echevarria did too good of a job of portraying a good relationship that it should have been a marriage. Just my opinion, of course. So next comment is from Brandon Neil Howells, who says, I like this episode, and I've always have. It's probably my Australian bias, but I enjoy Wendy Hughes' character, and her romance with Picard seems much more believable than his fling with that sleaze Vosh. Being musical myself, I enjoy the duets, and I get the feeling that Picard and Nella Darrin really do love each other. I'm going to have to delete a couple of points for 3 things. 1, how does Stellar Cartography manage to put the replicators in the library offline and forget to lock the door? 2, why does Troy not say, I'm an empath, Captain, when he tells her he's in a relationship with Nella Darrin? 3, why does Data not hear the lovers jamming in the Jeffrey tubes when Geordi does? I enjoy seeing Picard opening up a bit more. 7 Brandenburg concertos out of 10. So, that's a good point about not Stellar Cartography not locking the door. That whole bit at the start, not only should they lock the door? An excuse they give, oh, I don't expect anyone to be awake at this hour. Like it's a fucking starship. People are awake 24 hours a day. But, so that's a bullshit excuse. But not only should they have locked the door, they should have, I don't know, maybe informed command? Like, not to let anyone enter the room, and maybe made some kind of ship-wide announcement that would be a part of the official log that fucking Data would have reported to Picard about. By the way, stellar cartography is running a very sensitive experiment, so they do not want to be disturbed during this time. And for that matter, why the fuck wasn't Picard told in advance? I mean, he's the goddamn captain of the ship. He should have been made aware, if not in just a simple report or something, a memo, that they would be taking, the stellar cartography would be taking fucking everything offline that day. And maybe I'm imagining there should be some sort of like do not disturb sign on the door at the very least. I mean, Jesus Christ, there's so many things that they should have done, that should have happened, that make this scene unbelievable. But you know what? In the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's that big of a deal, but it is a flaw I do notice when I watch this episode. Anyway, thank you patrons so much for your comments. So my rating for Lessons out of 10 is going to be a 7, very good. And as a couple of patrons gave it an 8, I'm not willing to go that high, simply because of the fact that I think this episode is undercut by the fact we never see this romance again. Now, yes, I know I've been saying this only a billion times in this review, but there's a reason why I keep reiterating it, because it is the main issue with the episode. As I said, the writer did almost too good of a job of building this romance where you don't buy it, or at least I don't buy it, as a one-off, and I don't buy that they simply never talk to each other ever again. That seems cheap, and it undercuts the whole point of the episode, and this whole, how do I deal with being in love with a subordinate storyline would have worked better if they made it a reoccurring thing and actually showed him learning to deal with it, other than being like, yeah, you're right, it's not going to work, I'll just fuck off to a starbase and never see you again. Undercuts the whole thing. That being said, I still give it a 7 because still a great chemistry. Love the music, as I think it has one of the best music in the show, and the music works for the story. It works for the emotional heart of the episode, and the way they followed up on the Inner Light was brilliant. So I will give this a 7 out of 10. I was actually surprised. I liked it more this time around watching it than I had before, because I never really gave it a shot. Because I always have this memory of when I watched as a teenager of just being a boring episode. And to be honest, part of the reason why, and I realize that now intellectually, part of the reason why I had that feeling of it being boring wasn't just because I was younger and more immature, because even as I got older, I still saw it as kind of boring. The main reason why is because when I got older and never appreciate this more the way I did with other episodes like The Inner Light, again, hate to keep repeating myself, but the main reason why is because I didn't care about this episode. I didn't throw any of the emotion. I didn't see the heart and emotion in it because I didn't allow myself to get invested with it, because I know that she never appears ever again, and so what's the fucking point? Anyway, so that is it for my review of Lessons. So let's see what's coming up on my channel. Thursday will be my review for the DS9 episode Vortex. Saturday, I'll be over on Patreon to do a revisited, this time revisiting my review for The Chase, where I'm surely going to talk about Discovery Season 5. Shirley. Don't call me Shirley. And on Monday, I'll be back here on my main channel for another public review, this time talking about the DS9 episode Battle Lions, where we get to meet Mike from Breaking Bad. And then on Wednesday, back over on Patreon, so for another revisited, this time revisiting my review for Frame of Mind. So that's what's coming up next on my channel. Be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.